Good evening. On behalf of Voices of Hope, I welcome you all to this evening's program. I'm proud to introduce my son, Jacob Kornman, who's a grandson also of two survivors. Jacob was a founding member of Voices of Hope who attended our early meetings when he was still in high school. Today, there are thousands of books by survivors and a growing body of works by 2Gs, or children of survivors. But tonight, we are treated to a fascinating Holocaust story experienced and shared by a 3G, or a grandchild of survivors. The fact that Jacob and Menachem are here today is nothing short of a miracle. Enjoy.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Voice of Hope 2021 speaker series. My name is Jacob Kornman, and I'll be moderating tonight's program. As my mother said, I'm the grandson of Holocaust survivors, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce tonight's speaker, Menachem Kaiser, who recently had his excellent book published and is getting rave reviews. Menachem is a writer currently living in Brooklyn, New York. He grew up in Toronto, Canada, has a BA from Columbia University and an MFA in creative writing from the University of Michigan, and he was a Fulbright Fellow to Lithuania. His fiction and nonfiction publications have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, New York, Bomb, Vogue, and elsewhere. Tonight's talk will focus on his latest book, Plunder, a memoir of family property and Nazi treasure, which continues to receive great critical acclaim. After tonight's program, we will have a little time for questions at the end, so be sure to send your questions as they come up through the chat function to Robin Landau, and she will gather them all up and we will ask them at the end to Menachem. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Menachem Kaiser. Thank you for being here tonight, and congratulations.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you, Robin, Sharon, and Jacob for hosting me.
Thank you. Well, so I read the book just recently, and I was talking about it with someone today who just finished it. And I think a great way to start this off is, a lot of people, if you've read the book or have not read it, it's about Menachem's journey on to reclaim his grandfather's lost property from before the war. And I think it's an interesting way to start out. Can you talk a little about your motivations for reclaiming the building, maybe the motivations as they started and then the motivations as they developed as you went on this journey in the book?
Yeah, of course. It all kind of happened accidentally. So the book sort of centers around my grandfather, Mayor Menachem Kaiser, who I'm named for, but he died in 1977, which was 8 years before I was born. So I did not know him, but my ignorance of him really extends beyond that because I really didn't know anything about him. He died when my father was in his mid-20s. So I received a sort of like vague image of who he was, but I didn't really have any firm idea. But beyond that, I did not know anything about his time in the war. So his, what he went through during the war, where he came from, who his family was a complete blank to me. And to be very upfront, I really was never all that curious. I was just sort of not raised with the curiosity about it, and I never really felt all that compelled to investigate. And so I went to Poland for the first time really on a whim. So I been doing a research fellowship in Lithuania. And then towards the end of that, it's a sort of a long, zany story, but I got invited by the chief rabbi of Galicia, which is a region that does not exist, but yet has a chief rabbi, to come to Krakow for Rosh Hashanah. And I went, again, did not go for any familial reasons. I went really because it seemed fun and interesting. And while I was there, I was like, I'm here, I'm a good grandson. Let me sort of check out my grandfather's hometown. And I asked my father if he had any addresses. He gave me an address. I went, I took some photos of this building that I was sort of led to believe was my grandfather's childhood home. And I really never thought I'd ever go back. I really thought it was like a one and done, a sort of memory pilgrimage. And then I ended up spending quite a bit of time in Poland for research reasons. Again, nothing to do with family. And my father kept nudging me over those years. He's like, hey, Menachem, we own that building. My father had tried all these years to reclaim it. You now know all these people. You have a network. He kept nudging me and I kept ignoring him until finally in 2015, he just faxed me all the documents we had to Krakow. And I read them and I felt very moved. I felt for the first time a sort of sentimental attachment, or at least a way to be in conversation with my grandfather. And I saw that he had tried and failed for 30 years to reclaim the building, which I didn't know, or I knew really only in an outline, not in a detailed way. And I was in the privileged position where I could try and do what he had not been able to do. And so I contacted a lawyer, the killer who shows up in the book. And that's sort of like the first step I take and really the start of the story.
Yeah, that's great. One thing I wonder is, was it really the documents that you saw all at once faxed to you, or maybe partially the experience of being in Poland for all that time, maybe connecting you back?
That's interesting. From like 2011 to 2015, I've been spending a lot of time in Poland. But again, my own family history was just in the far, far background to the point where it just was not part of my consciousness. But you're asking like an interesting question. I think it informed it in ways that weren't really operating on a conscious level. I think I was sort of getting more involved in Polish history, doing a scholarship there, meeting more and more people who'd done quite a bit of work, both artists and scholars. And I think these questions, first in a really abstract way, were becoming really interesting to me. And then I found sort of this doorway. I found a way to make the questions much more personal and much more about me. And I was very that no one's really asked me that before. And I really appreciate the question, but you're right. Like there's a reason it didn't happen on my first trip there. I think I sort of needed this sort of storehouse of knowledge of the local scene, and sort of had to meet all these people and have these experiences in Poland in order to provide sort of like the foundation for my own journey there.
Right. I wanted to ask another question, which I was going to ask later, but I'll ask now. You in the book, you talk about you have a large family, your siblings, parents, and cousins, big family. How have they thought about both your journey with the property and also your book in general? You talk about your family and your family's history in a way that's, you say a lot, and you don't mention your family aside of your uncle and your father that much in the book. I'm curious what they've thought about the book. If they all think the same thing, different things.
I think the story in the book begins in 2015 when I start the reclamation process. So they were all informed about it. I think at that point it was very abstract and kind of weird. It was like a weird, funny story of stuff that was happening to me in Poland, and they were sort of along for the ride, but didn't sort of appreciate exactly what it was. And I was like, oh, there might be money at the end of this. Here's a property. No one in my family had ever been back to my grandparents' hometown. Although many of my siblings and my cousins had gone to Poland on like March to Living trips or similar trips. But again, even though I grew up in an Orthodox household, and we placed like a great emphasis on legacy, but we didn't place a great emphasis on that particular spot in that particular country. And so everyone thought this was sort of like, everyone I would say was bemused, I would say was like the overall thing. And they were interested. And look, and the story got weirder and weirder and weirder. And so like, they're like, what is happening? All these weird adventures keep happening to you. And so there was like fun fodder for the dinner table. But what happened is when the book came out, it became a lot less abstract. And like, a book in a way that I had not anticipated, it became very valuable even within my own family, because it sort of solidified the legacy, and it sort of reintroduced all of us to our own history. And so like, I knew all the stuff in the book, obviously I had written it, and I had been talking about it for years, but no one had really sat down with it and sort of appreciated it from beginning to end as like our own little family history. And it reintroduced a lot of questions, actually. And so my family started grappling again, or really kind of for the first time, with what that legacy really means. And it sort of set off a secondary conversation of like, what did my grandfather want? And so my father has like sort of been reinvigorated in this question. And so it's been overall, I would say, a really positive, not always easy conversation starter about like just the nature of family and the nature of family history.
Has anyone in your family, either before or after the book came out, gone with you to Poland? If you were my brother, I would be like, you got to take me, and I got to meet all these people.
No, I've been, there's been like we've had some aborted missions. I was to take my siblings with me, and the plan was actually for like the sort of final trial, the final court appearance, to go with my father. And my father was actually very interested in going. He had never been to his father's hometown, but COVID got in the way of that. And so, maybe one day, but so far, no one's really taken me up on my offer for the weirdest trip of their lives, which is, their loss.
It is interesting that almost I mean, obviously it's great to hear that it's been a great conversation, that made some great conversations, but it's so interesting that somebody could read all of this and about their own family and be so disinterested in going, not disinterested in the story,
definitely
but
no one's
going
disinterested. But I don't see
firsthand. I mean,
I like in my family, and I sort of other families I know of, grandchildren of child survivors. There's a gap, and so we place a big emphasis on the legacy. We don't place that much of an emphasis on place, and so that my book is sort of like bridging that gap. And people are like, oh wait, maybe I should go to that place, not just sort of tell the story and make sure it's important and make sure we tell our children, but like what is our relationship to that particular place, and in my case, that particular building. And so, yeah, I think people are sort of puzzling it out and processing it on their own terms.
yeah, as much as I say it, I think it is interesting because I was just talking about that with my mom, who's been to my grandmother's hometown twice in the last few years, and I have not been. And I also am not really, admittedly, in a rush to go to that specific town because, like you said, there's not, for me, an emphasis on the place so much. But maybe over time that will, my mom said, when you're older, you'll feel differently.
Yeah, I was kind of like where you were, and I had like a real reckoning, and I sort of experienced these emotions that I did not see coming and are sort of off brand for me, to be honest. And I was like, oh, what is my relationship to this place? I feel strange. I don't really know how to do this. And I had to, spend 5 years and write a book to get to the bottom of that. And I still don't have the answers, but it was something like a really unexpected experience.
Yeah. So moving on to the tunnels and the treasure hunters for a few minutes. In the book you meet them, and I imagine there's got to be some stories that didn't make it into the book. Is there anything that comes to mind interesting about your experiences? You visit one of them in their houses and see the collection. Are there any other things that you would like to share quickly that interested viewers might like to know?
Just for those who haven't read the book, to give like a quick overview of what we're talking about. So the, part of the book is sort of my descent into this subculture of Silesian treasure hunters, which is just a very large community, by most counts, over 100,000 people, of including, guys who are going out with metal detectors and, very sophisticated, sometimes even sponsored expedition groups using high-end equipment. And they're looking for treasure, but it goes a little bit beyond that. They're interested in what they call mystery, which is sort of, I would call, voids. And so they're very like, what happened here? And at the center of this culture are like these underground complexes built by the Nazis using mostly Jewish slave labor called Project Riza. And so, we'll talk more about it in a minute, but, I found out that they mythologized a relative of mine who turned out to be my grandfather's closest surviving relative, and they embraced me in turn as a celebrity. And so like one of the narrative threads of the book is sort of my being embraced by this community. And so Jacob's asking for the cut scenes, which is fun. Yeah, there was a lot cut for sure. It was sort of unrelentingly strange, particularly in the beginning when I didn't really have any fluency within this community. And so, yeah, I spent time with a count, a man who called himself a count, who lived like a squatter, or maybe was a squatter, in a castle without running water by himself, and had designed his own coat of arms and tried to scare the spirits out of me using ancient water. I mean, and that was like the first afternoon. But I think, yeah, I went 2 years in a row. I went to the Mystery Festival, which is something like a treasure hunter convention that includes everything from war reenactments to visitations with ghosts. And I spoke at that thing, and I had some strange experiences sort of throughout. And so, yeah, there was there was a lot. There was a lot that didn't make it in the book. I don't really regret it, but yeah, a lot of stories like that.
So obviously an interesting group, like the guy in the castle. You know, in the book, you at the beginning when you meet them, you are perplexed, perhaps even a little disgusted with some of the ways they talk about the events of the Holocaust. By the end of the book, I think there's a little more of a, you're really delving into why they act the way they do and how they deal with their own history as Polish people. Can you talk a little bit about your journey with that community and how your views changed of the individuals in it over time?
Sure.
It was a very interesting part of the book.
So my initial encounter with them was, yeah, I sort of thought of them as at best as very frivolous and kind of silly, of like boys with toys, like hanging out in the forest, getting drunk. And again, my initial encounter with them, I saw a lot of their quote unquote trophies, which was mostly Nazi paraphernalia that they had dug up. I found them to be very macho and have like a very particular way of interacting with the history, which was like an exploration one, which was very, I don't really know how to understand it because I came one from a way of, the mode was one of commemoration rather than of exploration. And so they were sort of treating these sites as sites of adventure, and I was very uncomfortable with it. Again, at best frivolous, at worst pretty pernicious and disrespectful. And but my opinion of them did change for sure. And so one, I understood that how large of a group it was, and it was very hard to categorize them neatly. It's not a homogenous group at all. And so one is they are doing collectively, at least, serious historical scholarship. And so the example I, cite all the time is this treasure hunter named Krzysztof, who had spent 3 years researching and discovering a concentration camp that had been wiped off the map. So one that, like, quote unquote, does no longer exist, even like in the history books, doesn't exist in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He found it. He was interviewing locals, went through archives. He brought me out to a field and he showed me a line of cemented in bricks that had been the barracks. And like, that was something he found. Another point is like these guys, I really appreciated, they were doing maintenance. They're like, these are sites of memory that no one is taking care of. And so like, if you think of like Holocaust memory as a map, you have sort of centers of memory, which is Auschwitz, the ghettos, some of the larger cities. But as you move further afield, there's just much, much less institutional resources or scholarship dedicated to these sites. And these sites they're going to either be remembered and memorialized and taken care of by amateurs or not at all. And these guys are doing the work. And so there's a chapter in the book where I spend a night with them on one of their expeditions, and like we get drunk in the forest and I sort of grapple with what they're saying and I'm having like a complicated time. But the chapter after it was cut. And going back to your last question, and that chapter is that they all woke up before dawn and spent 14 hours cleaning the site. And so, there's certainly, their attitudes are kind of complicated, hard to parse, definitely hard to relate to. But at the end of the day, these are the ones doing maintenance and they see themselves as guardians. And so sometimes they're there for reasons I don't approve of, but yet they do honor the sites, which again, no one else is doing that work. And so, yeah, my relationship to them and sort of my sense of what they were doing definitely evolved over my time with them.
Thank you for sharing. The tunnels, if you could talk a little bit about that network of tunnels and the mystery around them. And then also as a reader, for me, it was very hard. There aren't a lot of images in the book and it's hard to picture the scale, I think, of a lot of the tunnels. And I know you have some photos you wanted to share, which I think I saw one. It was pretty impressive. It was very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So the project is called, these tunnels are a series of tunnels. There's 7 of them. They're called Project Riza. There's a series of 7 tunnels. There might be more that we haven't discovered that surround Owl Mountain in Silesia near a city called Wałbrzych. And none of them are completed. So none of them were finished. The ones that are closer to completion, however, are enormous, sort of like staggering in scale. So we're talking square kilometers in terms of area, like 20-meter high ceilings, basically underground cavernous neighborhoods. And so they were built using mostly Jewish slave labor. About 14,000 Jews died as slave laborers on the tunnels. Constructed using mostly manual labor, so not that much machinery, very quickly. So we're talking like 18 months from like 43 to 45. And we're just, even during the time, were considered top secret. And so they would make concentric rings of German circles, and they would shoot people on sight who approached. Even decades after, sort of the secrecy that surrounded them is still very apparent in the Polish villages. And so people really don't talk about them for many, many years. But what makes them truly sort of enigmatic, even beyond the engineering wise, is the fact that there's virtually no primary German documentation. So there's just no German documents sort of saying what they were to be used for. We had, like, after the war, Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect, he does mention them in an endnote. And he basically said about over $1 billion, what's the equivalent of $1 billion today, was spent on them during 43, which was like, Germany wasn't exactly flush with cash. And more concrete was used than the country had, including all of its occupied territories, had at its disposal for air raid shelters. So just like an enormous infrastructure project. And I could show some photos. Let me do the share screen. Could you see that?
Yes, we can see that. Yeah.
So this is actually a photo from the first time I went in, from one of the smaller ones. 3 or 4 of them are open to the public. And so they're sort of operated like state parks. And so you go, you get a guide, it feels kind of responsible. The remaining ones, though, they're really literally just tunnels with a hole in the ground that you either have to know the GPS coordinates or have a guide to bring you. It is sort of illegal to go in there. So, it's kind of a gray area. So this was the first one I went into, called Complex Sabon. It's very tunnel-like, and these wooden A-frames are from the war. This was the original scaffolding that would have been removed when they completed it. This is another one. It's also, you're not really appreciating how dark it is. And so these were pitch black. So this is one from one of the bigger ones called Osufka, and you can see the reinforced concrete. So here, also from Osufka, so you can see here's the rail tracks, which they cart out the rubble. And you could see how they would do in engineering. They would do one tunnel on top of another and then collapse sort of the ceiling / floor in order to make a much larger tunnel. This room, to give you a sense of scale, is about 20 meters tall. So something about like 40 to 50 feet tall and something like 100 meters long. So just like a really enormous space.
And what were your feelings when you first went to some of these larger ones? Because they're a little disturbing, I think.
They're very disturbing.
Because of how large they are, I think.
Yeah. Let me get there. So this is the last photo I have of the tunnels. And this one of Osufka, this is one of like the largest areas of any of the tunnels. Where it's hard to get a sense of scale, but from where the photographer is standing till the end of that back of the wall is like 200 yards. And so it's really enormous. And so let me stop sharing screen. And so in terms of what they were used for, we have a pretty good idea. And so they would probably like something like an underground factory or maybe an underground headquarters or a combination. But again, there is no documentation. And so because of that sort of void of knowledge, it's attracted quite a bit of conspiracy theories. And so there's a lot of like colorful theories that have anything like time travel or anti-gravity or UFOs, or it gets very zany very fast. And so my feeling when I first went in, complicated. So when I first went in, I went to that smaller one and I had read a lot about it at that point, but then you step in and you're like, oh, you're sort of scrambled to make sense of it. And it sort of fries your brain and you don't really, you're like, it's one thing to read about, it's another thing to be in like a quote unquote Nazi tunnel on the side of the mountain that is like a mystery. And you really sort of grope for narrative. And then I went into the larger ones and you started to get an appreciation of the sense of scale. And then to me, it became a sort of a testament to the ambitions of the Nazi war machine, and one that is very chilling. And it's one that I haven't had the opportunity to see up close with very often. And especially because it's not quite a museum. Like there's not really many displays. They don't really try and explain what's going on. And you just sort of see like the war machine in its sort of at its height, in a sense, of like just how much effort and planning was going into this. And then, I spent more time with treasure hunters and more time in the tunnels, and you're like, this is also a site of mass death. And that's something that does get obscured sort of the first time you go, because you're kind of awed by it. And it is sort of framed, not entirely responsibly, as a site of like to marvel at the engineering. But again, more than 14,000 Jews that we know of died digging these tunnels. And so it is a site of mass death, and they are concentration camps in like the strict sense of the word. And so, they're hard to really grasp.
So you mentioned that your grandfather's cousin is a bit of a celebrity because he was part of this tunnel system and wrote about it in a memoir. He left a little bit of details about it, which people have really clung to. But if I could use that to kind of bring back to your family, in the book, it appears that you get a lot closer with your grandfather who you never knew by learning a lot about Abraham. Even though you don't know a lot about your grandfather, you feel that you know a lot about Abraham. To the extent that you feel like you maybe after all of this, that you know your grandfather maybe better than you did before, do you think it's the journey that you went on with the property, the reclamation of the property, or more like the journey of writing the book in general, like forcing yourself to think about these things, or do you not feel closer with him at all?
It's an interesting question. It's sort of a different kind of closeness. I did not actually learn anything new about him, about my grandfather, basically zero. And so in the sense of understanding who he was, and sort of what he wanted and like what he wanted to pass down to me, I feel I did not get closer to him, but still there was a pretty profound shift in how I related to him. And to me, the way I understand it and the way I frame it for myself is that my ignorance of him went from a easy ignorance to an uneasy ignorance. I felt like I was in a place to articulate my own ignorance. And so like that was something I really appreciated. It was a way for me to confront my own legacy. And there weren't really any answers at the end of this. Now, sort of post-book, it reignited conversation with my father about my grandfather. And so I feel very gratified for that. But no, in like the strict sense, I didn't get closer to him, but yet I do feel closer. Like I could be in conversation with him in a sense. And I felt like I was sort of building a sort of sentimental attachment to who he was, even if I wasn't getting closer to him particularly.
Yeah, since you wrote the book, so it came out a few months ago now. You've done a lot of these talks. Have you, through hearing people's thoughts on the book and in a lot of different ways, have you come to view anything differently since you wrote it? Like a lot, you've probably talked about it more the last few months in ways that you weren't driving the conversation than you ever had before. Have you come to view anything differently?
I like that question. Have I come to? I just I've done quite a number of these talks.
Or just new thoughts, I guess.
Yeah, the one thing I sort of knew this before, but it's been hit home in a way that is felt very special. Is just the ubiquity of these stories. Like I've just been in this position where I was able to explore my story really fully, and I've been able to write about it, and I've been very lucky, and I've been able to present it. But the amount of stories I get to hear about reclamation and exploration of people's own legacies is really overwhelming. And I just feel like I've been in this very special position to receive those stories and to hear other people's experiences. And it just feels like everyone has, mostly Jews, but also non-Jews, of a story of sort of like dipping into their family history and things getting very strange, very fast and meaningful, but not only meaningful, but meaningful in ways they didn't expect. and sort of finding meaning in spots that they wouldn't think they found meaning, or finding, whether that's like finding a new relative or finding a new object or finding that their whole story is wrong. And to me, that's always a very special moment when someone looks into their own family legacy and discovers they had it either a major or minor detail incorrect. And so, and I knew that. I even write about that in the book a bit, but sort of people reaching out and saying, you know, I read your book or I heard you talk, and I want to share this sort of piece of my family. And it's like, yeah, these stories are ubiquitous in a way that's, you know, very humbling for me, for sure. But that's been a very special experience to receive those.
So, yeah, I imagine. I mean, it's kind of like the tunnels. The ubiquity of it is both, I guess, in a weird way, comforting, but also like very disturbing as well. The ubiquity of the lack of detail and the horror. So when you hear these stories of reclamation, for me, one of the most compelling parts of the book was when you talk about not necessarily reclaiming, but not that you lost property, but you lost the traditions, the minhagim. And I think, like you're saying, the idea that Jews, non-Jews, that people are, it resonates with them, this idea of reclaiming or finding out about these traditions that were in their family for a long time. Do you think that lost legacy, as you said, your family cares a lot about legacy, but not as much about place, that idea of lost legacy is universal to everyone? Or is it really a specific thing that Jews who lost family in the Holocaust feel that at a specific point in time, they were cut off from their family's traditions and legacy?
I don't know. I mean, I consider myself only an expert on me, and even then I'm barely there. But the idea of lost legacy was one that was sort of, I didn't anticipate that one. And so just, I had this very moving experience that I recount in the book, where I discovered these old family videos and saw a tradition of how my grandfather used to make Havdalah. And then I sort of showed it to my father, and he had forgotten. And we had that sense of sort of restarting this legacy, or sort of like, you know, a loop, a chain had been broken, and we had the opportunity to sort of reconnect it. And yeah, there was a big struggle for me to sort of understand value. And so I think I was starting with this very literal sense of inheritance, of like something that had been passed down and me trying to reclaim. And the way I understood it initially was one of material value. It was worth X amount of money. And so the thing that I would sort of move to confront was the notion of different types of value that are passed down. And so you start from like, what is a sentimental value? What is a spiritual value? What is a legacy? And again, I was raised in an Orthodox home, which is going to emphasize sort of the tradition, and sometimes like the very literal mitzvahs and minhagim, and like the way we observe as a form of inheritance, much more than say like a building. And so I was saying, how do I prioritize these things? And these set off really difficult conversations, but really meaningful conversations within my family, of saying, what are our responsibilities, and what is our inheritance vis-a-vis our grandparents? And yeah, and so I imagine this idea of legacy from anyone who comes from like a particular culture is going to be a rich one. I would never step out of my own. I don't know. I wouldn't comment on anyone else's. I'd be way too afraid.
That's very fair. So the book is called Plunder, and you talk about a lot of different kinds of plunder, of property, of stories, of the memories that are different, that you're kind of, they change. And you talk a little in the book about when you first showed up at the building, when you met all the people, you felt a little like, you know, this is you talk about the difficulty of like, you know, we're reclaiming this, but also they lived here for decades. Can you, and also learning Abraham's story, can you talk a bit about, you know, your feeling, you went there to reclaim property, but then you also sometimes felt like you were plundering yourself. Can you talk about your feelings of being seen as kind of the outside person coming in and taking something?
Yeah, I think there's a few levels to it. So one, I came in with this sort of very comfortable conscience of like, I'm coming to reclaim my grandfather's property. This is Jewish property, has been lost. I'm coming to reclaim, and there's really nothing else for me to consider. I was pushed pretty hard, and I received quite a bit of feedback on that from locals. And so like people who live in Poland, both Poles and Americans, who sort of pushed me on what I was doing and said, is this appropriation? And I was like, I never really all felt that all that challenge on my moral or legal right to reclaim the property, but I was pushed to start considering my effects on the people who live there. And so I had gone in and not really thinking about the inhabitants of the building I was trying to reclaim. And again, I never was really troubled by my actions. I felt like we had the legal and moral right, but I was like, how do you sort of expand the narrative to include them? It's like, these were people, often people who didn't know anything, who had lived there a very long time. And if what I'm doing affects their lives, there's a certain sort of moral responsibility to understand that and to acknowledge that. And so that led me to sort of interact with them in ways that were often extremely uncomfortable. And I acted like a coward way more often than I acted what I would sense with any moral courage. And so, but yeah, there was, plunder is a strong word and has a sort of very strong pejorative connotation, but there was a sense of like, you know, you're sort of reaching in and sort of disturbing people's lives. And then there was another sense of like, how do we interact vis-a-vis our grandparents' legacy? And so I was like, what is my role within his story? And I was like, I sort of bumped up against these uncomfortable questions regarding my own motivations. And I was like, okay, I'm a writer. I'm sort of using his story for my own sort of career. And I don't really delve into that in the book because it will just get too meta and people start, you know, you just start drowning in questions. But yeah, that's an uncomfortable question. You know, like I have, you know, I wrote this book, you know, it received a considerable amount of attention and in a way that I was using my grandfather's story. And so like, I don't think that's a simple question. But the act of plunder is, yeah, is one of those, like, it was a title that we came up with kind of accidentally. It wasn't the initial title of the book. And but in the end, I have come to really like it. I was initially very skeptical of it, but it just it's operating on different levels. One, you know, the property, the treasure hunters, and me, myself, and like the way you framed it was like, was I plundering myself? Like I hadn't thought about it like that, but maybe, you know.
Yeah, I'm sure you went through a lot of rationalization of like, if we're successful, you know, everyone can stay that's living there, all these kinds of things. When you talk to people about reclamations, especially at the end of the book, you kind of shepherd someone in their own reclamation story, as like the expert now. Do you find that a lot of people that go through this kind of reclamation do it distantly, or they go to Poland and get their boots on the ground and do a little bit what you did, or do people kind of hire the killer and email with her? I don't know if she emails.
From the people I know who've done it successfully, it's always a long process. It's always a long process. I think there's a big difference if how close your connection is to that space. And so I know people who've reclaimed their own property, and that is going to have like a very different sort of moral arc to it, for sure. And this one that I was very cognizant of and sort of like pretty adamant about being like, I am not my grandfather. I do not have the same moral wherewithal as he does. And so like, I have to sort of interrogate my own motivations on a whole different level. I also think it's different for children of people who like are reclaiming what belonged to their parents. I think their sort of sentimental attachment is only 1 degree removed, and they have sort of like, if there's going to feel very different. I think grandchildren are in a different context. I think they have to sort of write and really interrogate what they're doing and why. And and it's not as simple. Or at least that's been my experience and the experience of other grandchildren I know who have successfully reclaimed it. There is also the question of money. It's like, how much is that property worth? And so there's a woman, an Israeli woman I know who reclaimed a property in Krakow that is worth, several $1 million. And so you're like, the relationship to that is going to be sort of different from, I know someone else who reclaimed a house that they lost money on it. It cost more, the legal fees were considerably more than what the house was worth. And so you're like, that is also going to be a factor in how people sort of shape their sort of attitude towards what they're doing. And it's also, everyone thinks their case is going to be sort of relatively straightforward in my experience. Like I was sort of led to believe that my case would take a year or 2 years, and it's now going on 6, and we're not done. And I think one of a real truth that wasn't obvious to me when I started is that you really lose energy. like you could really come in and feel like, what I'm doing is really important and critical, and I'm doing it for the right reasons. And you're just going to encounter a lot of obstacles, and you sort of lose that sort of that initial enthusiasm, and you
I
really
imagine the
start as they do.
enthusiasm, I imagine it's a little correlated with the things we were just talking about. Is it your parent or grandparent? Did you know them, or did you just hear about it through papers and your own parents? Is it worth a lot? Is it not? I mean,
Yeah,
it's going to impact how exhausted you get by the whole thing.
for sure. But I think really overall, I think people are going to have a very particular and very personal relationship to either whatever it is, property, let's say, and not only that, but their own mission. And sort of they're going to find meaning in a way that certainly like I would not be able to anticipate or dictate. And the one thing is it gets strange and it gets meaningful. It might not be in the ways you expect, but it is inevitable.
So I'm going to ask you one last question, and before I take some of the questions from the audience, the book, I will not, without spoiling anything, leaves in a bit of an open-ended way. That's how it ends. Did that feel right from the beginning? You were like, I got to leave it open-ended because this story is open-ended, or did that kind of happen more like accidentally?
Are you talking about the epilogue, or are you talking about sort of the last chapter?
I'm talking about the epilogue.
So the epilogue, for those who haven't read the book, is me and a guy named who I call Stephen, and we go searching for 10 golden eggs that had belonged to his father-in-law in an attic in a house in Benjin. Sort of the banal, unexciting answer is that I really liked that story and wanted to include it in the book, and the only place it would go was the epilogue. I couldn't really justify its inclusion anywhere else. But I do think, sort of without me realizing it, I sort of lucked out and that it works. I think sort of like people have been reading interesting things into it, which I didn't necessarily do on purpose, but I still appreciate it. Of sort of like, I think, Jacob, you mentioned this, of sort of me being the guide, like me being sort of the expert or the treasure hunter, taking, this next guy on his adventure and sort of leading him into the world where I had inhabited for all these years. And so I didn't mean to leave it open-ended. I sort of wrote it the only way I knew how, and sort of with the constraints I had and what I was allowed to say. And yeah, it was more writerly than anything else, which is an unexpected answer.
It's very interesting you say that, because to me, and I think my mother agreed, it was a perfect ending because to be open-ended, because with your own grandfather and Abraham, there's so many questions you still have that it has to be open-ended, because none of these stories are ever, I mean, that's how I read it. None of these stories are ever, done up with a bow, because there is just so much information you'll never know. So to me, it was very fitting, but it's interesting that it was kind of like by accident.
It's sort of accidental. And to me, there was a read that was someone, another interviewer mentioned to me, they're like, that last chapter is sort of a practical application of the book as a whole. But sort of the argument I make, especially towards the end of the book, is that the resolution is not the point. As if you're here for the easy resolution, you've missed everything I'm trying to do. And it's interesting to see how many people get really frustrated by the end. And in a way, like, I totally get it. It's like this cliffhanger. Did he or did he not find these 10 golden eggs? It's a sexy story that I frustrate the reader with. But I really didn't anticipate people caring, which sort of speaks to my naivete. But also I was like, I wasn't here to sort of entertain. Yeah. So, but it sort of fit accidentally.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go to yeah, and I wouldn't say it's not an I mean, some people probably like it because it's an entertaining treasure story, but I think it really does, the mystery of it is, and you never really find out the true answers, really fits the book well, I thought. So I'm going to go to some of the questions.
Wait, before you ask a question, I want to put an email address. I put it in the chat. If people want to reach out to me with their own stories of reclamation or more general questions or advice in my limited capacity, please be in touch. The email goes directly to me. I'd love to hear from you, and whatever it is. If there's a question not appropriate for the group, just please be in touch. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think we're also going to put in a link to where you can buy the book for anyone that hasn't read it yet. But so some of the questions from the audience, when someone wants to know if you are still in touch with any of the treasure hunters at all.
Oh yeah. I'm in touch with them plenty. And so right when the book was published, the ones who could read English read it on their, on Kindle. A couple of them got in touch with me to talk to me about what was in the book. And so they tended to be not so sort of like the average treasure hunters. They tended to be like a little bit more educated and lived in cities. And they had really nuanced takes on what was in the book. And I actually invited them to appear on any interview they wanted, any sort of book talk, but they were shy. They didn't want to. I'm in touch with them a lot. There's going to be a book review that appears in the Treasure Hunter magazine called Odkrytsa, which I am very excited for. And a couple weeks ago, I got word that there will be a Polish publisher. So they'll be translated into Poland. They're beyond any doubt, every single one of those guys is going to read that book. They really like being written about. There's a little bit of a sort of showmanship. And so I'm definitely in touch. I'm in touch with Joanna all the time. I needed permission from a bunch of them to publish certain excerpts in the book. So yeah, and they're extremely active on Facebook. They're constantly like, talking smack about each other. So I don't really understand what's going on in that world, but I'm definitely in touch with a lot of them.
Got it. Someone wants to know a quick, one word answer. The name of the city your grandfather lived in?
Sure. Sosnowiec or Sosnowiec, depending on, Polish versus Yiddish.
I hope that answers that person's question. Maybe someone else wants to know, and I remember this part in the book, but you'll be able to say it a little better. Were there mass graves around the tunnels? What was the evidence around the tunnels of the people who had died there?
Yeah, there are, and there's constantly more being discovered. And so, yeah, the short answer is yes, not all of them have been found. Basically, there was a series of concentration camps. So the Gross Rosen network, which is a network of between 100 and 130 camps, as far as we know, that's where the labor came from. And so they weren't working and living in the tunnels. They were mostly working they were living in the camps, marched to the tunnels where they had to dig and work. And so, but they are sort of no shortage of graves associated with those camps.
Yes. Someone wants to know that knowing what you know now, would you, if you were going back, would you do anything differently from the beginning of when you set out to Poland?
It's an interesting question. Let's see. Well, look, the book, if you read the book, you'll see just how many mistakes I made. It was just like basically constant mistakes, misreading documents, my lawyers messing up, being in the wrong building for 2 years. It's just a constant series of errors. Now, yeah, if I had known they were errors, I would have avoided them. But, the story would be very different. And I was like, the nice thing about writing a book is that when you mess up, it makes for a better chapter. And so would I do anything different? It's a hard question. Maybe I would have hired a better lawyer, but I still
impossible.
And so like, I don't know. If I had known better, maybe I wouldn't have done it at all. I knew how complicated it was. Look, when I started this, I was really not planning to write about a book. I was pretty adamant that I wouldn't write a book about it. And so, yeah, it's kind of I don't know. I would have been, all those sort of the boring reasons. I would have been like more patient or better hydrated. I definitely, I kept getting sick. So things like that.
Someone wants to know that when you were there, you mentioned you were studying a lot of history in Poland before you even began the reclamation journey. Did you encounter you mentioned one or two in the book, did you encounter a lot of Polish, Holocaust scholars or writers or just Polish historians? And did they affect or deepen your, feelings about the process of reclamation and grappling with, Polish history, regular Polish, the way they grapple with their own history?
Yeah, so I was spending most of my time in Poland up until that point was in Krakow, mostly in the summers, and there is a really robust, I would say, infrastructure and of scholarship and art surrounding Jewish memory, which is some Jews and a lot of non-Jews. And so I found not just Holocaust scholars, but a sort of like almost an industry devoted to Jewish memory and an infrastructure and institutional support of that. And so it was constant. I was meeting constantly people, Poles and non-Poles, and Americans who were living in Poland or visiting Poland, who were devoted in their work or art to these questions of Jewish memory, which I found endlessly stimulating, and sort of was constantly having my mind expanded about these questions, even before I got to my own personal questions.
Someone would like to know, would the reclamation process be easier, I guess, like legally, if you were a Polish citizen, if you had Polish citizenship, or would it be exactly the same? Or you might not know.
It would definitely be easier if I spoke Polish.
Right.
If it would be easier if I was a Polish citizen, I don't know. I'm like actually planning on becoming a Polish citizen, and so it might not be a theoretical question soon, and so I have no idea. I don't think so. I don't know why it would be. Like I don't know if I was getting, like, let's say, I don't know if any, let's call it, ungenerous judicial act was because I wasn't Polish. So,
you know,
but
I know you
don't
don't.
know.
I know you don't speak Polish, but I have to imagine that during this journey, you tried to learn a little Polish. Did you like try and give up, or you just, I can't learn Polish?
Which is like one of the biggest lacks of foresight in my life, like to not understand in 2013 or 14, like how much time I would spend there. I did for a bit. I did for a few months. I did some online courses, and I learned a little, and then, but it was just completely nothing, and it completely evaporated after like 3 weeks. So no Polish.
Some people would like to know if there's been any updates that you can share without, I guess, spoil. I don't know. I'd rather you not spoil it for everyone, but if there's any interesting updates, either with your family or with the property
Sure.
that you'd like to share.
So, obviously the day I submitted the final manuscript to the publisher, like literally that day, I got word from the lawyer that like the next thing had been cleared, like sort of the next legal obstacle, which was securing the death certificates, which I sort of knew that was going to happen, like bring an umbrella, guarantee it won't rain sort of thing. And then over Passover, there was a trial, which my father testified. So he, and about sort of the estate, more or less. And so that was cleared also. And so we've made incremental progress, or what feels like incremental progress, but I haven't heard anything in like 2 months, so I don't really know what's happening. But the courts are in disarray just because of the courts themselves and because of COVID. And so there is quite a backlog.
I want to ask one more question, which I think I got to all. I used one of my questions that we didn't get to, which is, and I know we talked about this before, but you talk a lot about in the book about there is this like Holocaust genre of books and movies, and it's like its own genre. And in the book, you don't have a lot of details about your family, so you theorize about possible stories and explanations to fill in the gaps. And I know it's a common discussion that some feel that blending fiction with fact in this kind of area is inappropriate, because it distorts things and is, I guess, fodder for deniers of the Holocaust. Do you have thoughts about this general debate, or has your view changed over time? I think you can't help but theorize when you have no facts, but in terms of being a writer yourself, do you have any thoughts about that?
I do, I guess. Let's see. I think there's a contract with the reader. So I think if you're saying, I'm saying a true story, then you do your best to say a true story. That doesn't, you might not get to like quote unquote objective historical truth, especially if you're writing a memoir and it's being like mediated through your own experiences and through those that you're interviewing. Facts are going to be wrong. There isn't a memoir out there that gets it, quote unquote right. But I do think there's a very important contract with the reader of saying you are not fabricating anything. In terms of like making stuff up, as long as it's being clear and so that's being clearly conveyed to the reader, that's a different question. And so I think we should sort of also appreciate that how some like even like Night, which is held up as like the sort of text of Holocaust memory, is one that was shaped. It is a novel. And so it was one that it was originally 800 pages. And so like stuff was culled, stuff was, shaped and reshaped. Or the Diary of Anne Frank, it was edited twice over, by the father and then by the editor. And so there should be an understanding of what sort of like the limits of literature. And so like, and it is not, they're sometimes read as like strict historical truth, but they are stories, and they can be true stories without being purely factual stories. And so the sort of the trickier question is, what role do these stories play? And so are they sort of conveying sentiments? Are they conveying truths? Are they sort of conveying personal truths, which might not sort of exactly align with historical truths? And what do we do when, like, I mean, every few years we find out about another memoir that's like made up. And so you have like the painted bird or whatever it is. And you're just like, how do we, you're just like, our value system, we have like a value system of like true Holocaust books and like Holocaust novels. And like, it's just, in my experience, it tends to be a lot fuzzier than that binary.
Well, thank you for your thoughts. We are just about actually out of time. It's 8 o'clock. So please join me in thanking Menachem for such a remarkable talk tonight and sharing everything. The book is great. Thank you for speaking with us tonight, Menachem, and our deepest thanks to everyone in our audience for your engagement and spectacular questions. You can learn more about Menachem Kaiser's work and purchase his book in the links provided in the chat. If you like tonight's program and want to see more of us, consider making a donation at www.ctvoicesofhope.org. It's in the chat. You can use our text to give number, and you can also find us on Venmo. All of the ways to donate tonight are listed in the chat box. Before you go, I just want to share some details about the next event, which will be on July 12th. Our speaker will be Sarah Wildman. Sarah is the author of Paper Love, Searching for the Girl My Grandfather Left Behind. This will be another exciting conversation, so be sure to register at the link in the chat. All of our upcoming speakers are listed on our website at ctvoicesofhope.org. While you're there, check out all of the Voices of Hope educational and commemorative programs, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for the latest updates and much more. Thank you again, and good night. Thank you, Menachem.
Thanks, everybody.